How can we relate with the forms of the world in a meaningful way through the five senses and through the mind so that the world itself becomes something that benefits and nourishes our path instead of something that gets in the way of our path? That's really the essence of what we'll be looking at in today's episode, and I hope you enjoy. In our previous episodes, in the series featuring the sacred sciences, some of the basic principles of how the different esoteric and spiritual traditions in the world function, looking at some of their root or their foundational principles of operation. We looked at how consciousness relates with time. We looked at how consciousness relates with space. And now in today's episode, we're going to be looking at how consciousness relates with form. In the same way that not all space is the same as far as how consciousness relates with it. Not all time is the same as far as consciousness is concerned. Likewise, not all forms are the same. And there's a few different ways we can approach this issue. And what I decided to use is the classic Hindu philosophic perspective through Samkhya philosophy of the three gunas, that we can more or less break up all kinds of qualities, all the different natures of things into these three gunas, these three basic qualities, which is sattva guna, rajoguna, and tamoguna. When we look at these three things, what we're looking for is what is their effect on consciousness. So this is why I'm using this scheme. The guna teachings, the teachings on the three gunas from Indian philosophy, are about how things relate to consciousness. And so when we're trying to understand form, and by form here we mean the quality of things as perceived through the five senses and through the mind, right? We have five ways that we can approach form. We have our five sense faculties, and they each have their five sense objects. And then we have, in many classic systems, the mind itself is considered as a sixth sense, which itself senses thought objects. And looking at all six of these things and understanding that the only way we can experience any form whatsoever, whether it's psychological form, emotional form, physical form, is through these six avenues of perception. Looking at it from here and understanding how consciousness relates with it, we need to have a way of qualifying the differences between different appearances visibly, different audible sounds, different tastes. How do we arrange them in a way to understand the way that consciousness relates with them? And this is where the teachings on the three gunas comes into play. When we say that something is sattvic, that it has a sattvic nature, what is meant is that its effect on consciousness, or at least the way consciousness interacts with it, is one that enlivens consciousness, that makes it subtler, makes it lighter, makes it purer, makes it simpler and more peaceful. So when we think of sattva guna, we have to think of peace and ease and joy and a kind of lightness, even light itself associated with sattva. And really everything that we classically think of as being spiritual is often falls under the veil of sattva. Now, of course, there are some spiritual traditions, like some of the tantric traditions, that deal deeply with things that are often considered not spiritual at all. But that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. For the sake of just teaching, classification, we're going to be kind of treating sattva and spiritual as almost being synonymous with each other. So, rajoguna, on the other hand, is going to be those things which excite us, aggravate us, drive us into activity. Much of the modern world is very rajasic, meaning much of the modern world excites our mind, it excites our senses, it excites our hearing, our taste, our touch. All five senses and the mind are constantly being excited in the world today. We're constantly being stimulated through all forms of different activity, entertainment, stimulants, drugs, alcohol, sex, TV. All these things are constantly stimulating our five senses and constantly stimulating the mind. So consciousness has what we call a rajasic relationship with those things. And then there are things which are considered tamasic. So tamoguna are things which make us feel heavy, depressed, sad, destructive. Tamoguna is related with inertia, so it's the tendency of bodies towards destruction and annihilation. And the more that we engage in tamoguna, kind of the heavier and sicker, the sicker mentally we become, the sicker physically and emotionally we become, the foggier our mind becomes, the kind of slower and more lethargic our energies become, until eventually we kind of become dead inside. So a lot of our mental health issues today are often quite tamasic in nature, because somebody who's really full of tamoguna, due to contemplating a lot of sad things, due to lacking the vitality and vibrance of rajoguna and sattvaguna, the energies have kind of become dull, and the body has become dull. And so everything has now become too slow, too cold, and in a sense kind of dead inside. So there's a way of relating to things that's very tamasic. That consciousness, there are certain sounds, certain physical sights, certain sensations that are considered to create a tamasic relationship with consciousness. And then likewise, there are those which have a rajasic relationship with consciousness. They excite us and irritate us. And there are those which have a sattvic relationship with consciousness, which help uplift us and purify us. They put us at ease. Really, everything we're trying to achieve in the spiritual path for most people, things such as ease and happiness, freedom from the cycles of suffering associated with worldly activities, all these kinds of things are really connected with sattva guna. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at how do we relate in a sattvic way with our five senses and with our mind. What kinds of things help encourage a sattvic atmosphere psychologically and physically and emotionally within ourselves. And we're going to be looking at this both on an outer perspective, which is a more mundane perspective for regular practitioners, meaning how do we take advantage of our five sense experiences and the fact that we have a mind to create a really ideal environment psychologically and physically for our practice. And we're going to be looking at it inwardly, which is a little bit more tantrically, a little bit more esoteric, as to how do these five senses and the mind manifest really when they start to almost transcend the sattvic guna. How do they really manifest in their purest state so that they get absorbed into deeper levels of reality? And these are some of the themes we're going to be looking at. Our first consideration are the outer manifestations, or the outer forms. So sometimes these things are broken into outer, inner, and secret, which can get very kind of classically esoteric. For today's video, I'm just going to kind of look at it in terms of outer and inner. So when we talk about the outer experiences of form, is the way that our consciousness relates to outer conditions, meaning the actual sense objects themselves that are outside our body and outside of our mind, and then how the mind itself relates to its own concepts that it draws from the world around it. So when we look at it this way, we have, of course, our five senses, right? We have sight, we have hearing, we have taste, we have touch, we have smell, we have all these things, and we have the mind itself with its own objects of thought. Now, outwardly, how can we use these things so that these five senses become inundated with a kind of sattvic quality? In other words, how can we take them and transform them so that instead of the five senses becoming somewhat problematic, which is what they are for many people, where they become very tamasic or rajasic and end up causing issues, how can we create a situation where we're encouraging a sattvic environment amongst these sensory faculties? So we start with the sense of sight. And the sense of sight is related sattvically with all kinds of sacred iconography. So how can we, in our day, in our home, in our meditation room, how can we create a space that is visually very sattvic, meaning visually it induces peace, it creates comfort, it creates ease, it creates a feeling of well-being, and ideally, even more than that, creates a situation that encourages things like meditation and sacred contemplation. How do we create an environment like that? So this can differ widely depending on the kind of person. For some people, this may be a very kind of zen, almost austere, very simple meditation room, very empty, without much in it. Maybe just a little plant or something, or a little statue of the Buddha. For others, this can be very elaborate, especially if you're part of a tantric tradition or a very ritualistic tradition. There might be prayer flags and banners and sacred iconography of different deities and ritual implements and a beautiful altar set up, the ancestors, the gods and deities and your lineage. There may actually be many things, right? In fact, your meditation room may be very visually stimulating in a way, which again, you're trying to create a sattvic environment, not necessarily too rajasic. So you want to make sure that it's stimulating in a positive way, that if it encourages you to activity, then it's motivating you to sit and meditate, to sit and pray, to do your sadhana, to do your spiritual work. So this is how we visually relate to the environment in a kind of sattvic way, especially in our meditation room. This becomes very important. With hearing, there's many ways we can engage our hearing into our sadhana, but one of the main ways is through mantra, through prayer, and through mantras, through sacred verbal formulas that are repeated, through hymns and chants that are sung. There are ways that we can keep the faculty of hearing constantly engaged with something sattvic, with something that is very beatifying to our mind, something that makes us think of holy things, so that audibly we're using our sense faculty of hearing to help support our meditation, so that, and which is really what a lot of these things come down to. We want to make sure that everything we're seeing is supporting our meditation, everything we're hearing is supporting our meditation, everything we're smelling is supporting our meditation, anything we taste is supporting our meditation, anything we touch is supporting our meditation, anything we think of is supporting our meditation. So when we're in the meditation room, when we're trying to sit and practice, we want to create a situation not just visibly but audibly as well, that kind of inundates our mind into the sattvic, pure, uplifting quality. And the way that we do this is usually through mantras and through hymns. Some people in today's world especially may like to play certain music, chants and hymns and sacred songs while they sit and meditate, or ring a meditation bell like a Tibetan singing bowl, or a gong or something like that, to keep their mind focused and to keep their mind in a meditative state. Classically in the tantras, it is through mantra, through the recitation of certain sacred formulas, which are seen in and of themselves as having a special kind of divine quality, even in just hearing them, that even somebody who wasn't trying to meditate, if they heard them, might derive some benefit from it. So those are often chanted so that not just do we have a psychological aid to keep ourselves focused on the work at hand, but even there's something almost ineffable happening with what it is we're hearing. And so this is how we can engage the faculty of hearing into our meditation. Now, how do we engage feeling, the faculty of feeling? This can be done a number of ways. Classically, from the tantric perspective, this is actually accomplished through bliss, through the kind of bliss and joyfulness and lightheartedness created from meditation practice. It can be very physically inundating, but we're going to look at bliss actually more when we deal with the inner realities of the five sense faculties during meditation. On the outer level, one way that we can engage feeling, and one way that is usually done, is through mudras, through different certain sacred hand gestures. A lot of people are familiar with things like chin mudra, gyan mudra, pranayam mudra. And, of course, we have more elaborate mudras like offering mudras that we can do. And various ways that through stimulating the ends of the nerve endings of the fingers, where we have a lot of nerve endings in our hands, and through kind of stimulating the hands as we practice, not only, according to the ancients, do these nerve endings in the fingertips have some kind of effect on our actual brain and the way that we think, but also it engages the sense faculty of feeling, of sensation, into our meditation in a very interesting, palpable way. So this is an aspect of how do we engage our sensations into our meditation that a lot of modern practitioners really don't take advantage of, because not a lot about mudras has been taught very effectively in the West, or at least not a lot of tremendously reliable information. Most people do, though, engage some kind of mudra when they sit. A lot of people will do the like the Buddha grasps the pearl, where they have their hands here in this kind of basic Zen or Buddhist position. Some people in Namaste or Prarthana Mudra here will be praying, and then a lot of people when they pray they'll hold their hands up. We do actually engage with mudras quite a bit, even unconsciously. A lot of people when they get nervous, they may start to rub or move their hands or fingers in a certain almost nervous way. And this is because on some subconscious level, the brain seems to be aware that in the manipulations of the fingertips and in the stimulation of those nerve endings, different effects can be produced in our brain and our energy and our breathing. There's been some interesting studies done about how the placement of the hands affects our breathing. I heard a story once, unfortunately I can't cite it. I heard a story once of a yogi who was lecturing at a university teaching about breathing, and he had everybody just do a few series of big deep breaths under observation, and then he had them do a simple mudra And he didn't tell them what it would do. And then he told them all to now keep breathing. And what was discovered was that when they did this mudra, everyone's breathing shifted from being very lung-oriented in the upper body to being a much more diaphragmatic, full abdomen-engaging breath. And they weren't conscious that this change was happening. This is something that happened automatically. And so we could really talk about mudras at great length, but for the purpose of today's video, at least it goes to help us engage the sense faculty of sensation into our practice. Next, we have the sense faculty of taste. So how do we engage taste? This is something that can be a little bit hard to do if you're not following some kind of more religious or even sacerdotal or ritualistic method of spiritual sadhana. Taste is classically engaged outwardly through offerings. So it's called the naivedya, the food offering. So when we make the food offerings to the deity or to the masters, to our ancestors, we ourselves partake a little bit of the remnants of that because it's considered to have special blessings in it. And then this is how this is considered to be a very sattvic way of relating with taste. Right? So anyone can do this in terms of blessing their food. On the largest scale, of course, we can relate with taste by trying to eat primarily a sattvic diet, avoiding things like rotting flesh and putrid flavors and things associated with flesh and meat. And instead preferring things that have better flavors, more wholesome flavors and taste, things that don't taste like they're rotting and dying. But even in our practice, in our meditation, we can partake of things like food offerings and things that we prayed over and offered to different beings and offered to our lineages or to various deities. And this is part of the way that this was classically done. Inwardly, there's a really interesting way that we relate with the sense of taste, but we're going to get into that here in the next section. For now, outwardly, it's classically done through things like food offerings, drink offerings, milk offerings, so on and so forth you can do. And then you take a sip of it afterwards. And so this is part of how the taste gets engaged. Smell is engaged through one of the more popular implements used in modern meditation by spiritual practitioners all around the world, which is incense. Right? Incense has been a part of every religious spiritual tradition you can think of, even very mind-only schools or schools that focus, tend to vie away from things like offerings and such. They'll still often light incense sticks. Even the Zen school, the Theravada schools, will often light incense sticks and make offerings. And so this helps engage the sense of smell. The sense of smell is really interesting faculty. And I think one of the reasons why incense has been a prominent theme going all the way back, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, all of India's history through China, Tibet, everywhere, ancient Sumeria. Incense has been a huge part of spiritual offerings. So why? And I think that considering the strange relationship that the faculty of smell has with our memory and with our brain, and the way that smells can trigger memories in a really interesting way. So there's some kind of special relationship that this sense has. Maybe at a previous stage in human life, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, we had a much stronger faculty of smell, and that was more important for our survival. I don't know. But somehow it seems like everybody has realized smell has some kind of strange effect on the mind, on the brain. Things like aromatherapy are really interesting to study and to experiment with, because it can be astounding how aromatherapy can help you actually manage your emotions and your psychological states. Not fix them, but they can help you manage them. They can help you in a way, make them a little bit more malleable, a little bit more workable and usable. And so likewise, if we create certain fragrances that have a sattvic smell, right? Obviously, you don't want to have a burnt or really kind of foul smell in your meditation room. If you create a nice sattvic smell, things like rose, for example, is considered very sattvic, and lavender and jasmine, and also we look at sandalwood is a very popular one in many of the old traditions, myrrh and frankincense. All these things have very kind of a sattvic uplifting effect on one's mind. And I think one of the reasons why this has always played such a role in spiritual traditions is because there's some kind of special connection between our brain and the faculty of smell that we can use and kind of take advantage of, so that when we smell certain fragrances, we naturally begin to get into kind of a meditative state of mind, even if we weren't maybe planning to meditate. If somebody's burning some frankincense or myrrh for whatever reason, and we smell some, it may actually start to naturally put us into that state. So because of this relationship we have with the faculty of smell, incense can be a really nice tool we can use to help ground the mind through the sense of smell into a nice, peaceful, sattvic state for our practice. And finally, we have the mind itself. How do we get the mind to engage in a sattvic way? And this is normally done through the actual sadhana. Whatever sadhana you're doing, maybe it's chanting the name of God, maybe it's contemplating one of God's forms, maybe it's reading Holy Scripture, maybe it's meditating on a light between the eyebrows, watching your breath, whatever you're engaging the mind in that is trying to lead it to a subtler state and ultimately towards its own realization, inwards towards its own nature. That is the sattvic activity. Right, to be engaging the mind in a very egotistic way or imaginary way, where it's very aggravated, is rajasic. And to be slumbering off and trying to stay awake while you meditate means the mind is too tamasic. So a sattvic mind is one where what we're engaging the mind in, usually some kind of single-pointed concentration, what we're engaging or trying to absorb the mind in is beginning to produce a sattvic effect on the mind, meaning the mind is very clear, very alert, very light and responsive and aware. If it's all over the place, too rajasic. If it's tired and falling asleep, that's too tamasic. So mental activities such as reflection, dialectic, contemplation, asking yourself, who am I? Meditating on forms of God, chanting the name of God. There's many different, depending on your tradition, many different ways you can kind of lift the mind into the sattvic state. But ultimately what we're trying to do is use one of the tools available to you based on your spiritual tradition to elevate the mind to a kind of sattvic and pristine state, which is ideal for recognizing its own nature. Now I'd like to talk about something a little bit neater than the kind of outer ways we can relate to the five senses. And that's the way that they begin to interiorize during spiritual disciplines and practices. So if we look at the traditions, there's general signs we get. Each of the five senses and the mind itself each have a kind of sign that they have fully turned inwards. And this can only happen when they're already in a very sattvic state, when they're already in that very pure, light, alert, receptive state, and the mind itself is turning inwards deeply. Then the sense faculties themselves will actually follow the mind in a way and start to turn in as well. And there, within yourself, psychologically, emotionally, physically, there are certain signs that you'll perceive. There are actually a new level of sensory objects that the five senses now begin to perceive that they didn't perceive when they were turned outwards. The first of these, beginning with sight, are certain spiritual lights that we begin to see. So if you meditate in different places for long enough, by different places I mean different focal points on the body, turning the mind inward and meditating on a place like top of the head or the heart, the space beneath in the middle of the abdomen, if you meditate on a place between the eyebrows, very popular place. If you turn the mind inwards, the mind becomes very still, and the sense faculty of sight becomes totally locked, turning its attention towards that. You'll start to see lights. Now, it doesn't happen with everybody right off the get-go, but in a lot of traditions, there's actually, such as the Kriya Yoga tradition, there's a whole kind of doctrine and series of teachings about these lights, about the orders they manifest in. The great Sufi Suhrawardi wrote a beautiful dissertation on the way the lights manifest in different ways. So we see them in Sufi traditions. The lights are mentioned in the cutting through and leaping over teachings of Dzogchen, for those who are familiar with that. Many of the yogic traditions talk about these lights. So these lights are seen, sometimes even with the eyes open, but usually at first they're seen with the eyes closed, when the mind becomes totally concentrated inwardly, totally turned inwards. And the seeing itself is very alive and bright. So the sense faculty can't be dull. The sense faculty turns inwards, but it's still very energized. It's still very bright and clear, which is kind of hard to describe what that is experienced as. You kind of just have to experience it yourself. Then you begin to see certain arrays of lights in different orders, in different ways. I'm not going to go into the whole doctrine here. But this is one of those things that's fairly easy to prove to yourself. It can take some regular practice, maybe even a few years of discipline. But across the board, most practitioners tend to start talking about these lights that are seen. Now, maybe there are things being created by the brain. Maybe there's something else going on. But regardless, there's one trait that all these lights have in common. They have a very hypnotic effect upon the mind. So when you begin to get absorbed into these lights, they almost pull you into them, despite yourself. And the mind stabilizes to a degree that it couldn't stabilize before, and you begin to enter into deep states of meditation. So these lights can be used as a kind of guide or anchor to make the mind turn deep within, far deeper within the normal. and to make it become totally stabilized inwardly. So this is the way that sight turns inwards. Hearing turns inwards through another very well documented spiritual phenomena across many different traditions, which are the inner sounds that begin to arise. So just like how there's certain lights that begin to happen when you close your eyes and turn inwards, and these lights are visible. These aren't psychological lights. These are you see them with, you feel like you're seeing them with your physical eye. In the same way, there's certain sounds that begin to arise. And again, these sounds, they're not psychological. They seem to be physically audible sounds, but nobody's hearing them except you, right? So I don't know if the brain's creating them. Since you're physically hearing it, the brain must be playing a role in it. But somehow certain noises begin to arise that are somewhat musical in nature, and have a kind of vibration and heat often associated with them. And the most prominent of these is a kind of ringing sound. And it's not tinnitus. I can say that quite affirmatively because I've had tinnitus my whole life, had all kinds of hearing problems when I was young. And when this sound arises, it's very clear that this is not that. It has a totally different feel, has a different effect. And again, unlike tinnitus, which does not have a stabilizing effect on the mind, this sound has a very stabilizing effect on the mind. So in the Sanskrit traditions and yogic traditions, this is called the Omkar, which is probably its most popular form, right? It's symbolized by the mantra Om. Doesn't mean you're actually audibly hearing the word Om while you're sitting there meditating. It's a kind of resonance that all of a sudden begins to fill you. It fills you psychologically, but you feel it resonating with you physically as well. And it's, again, just like the lights. It's very leads to a deep state of meditative absorption if the mind becomes turned inwards and centered on that as a meditation tool. And again, the hearing and the mind both need to be in a very sattvic state in order to turn in and realize this. The inner state of feeling is bliss. So as you get deeper into your practice and you begin to, have some of these more kind of strange meditation experiences, as the mind stabilizes, a kind of bliss begins to naturally occur. Again, who knows what exactly the source of this bliss is? It could be hormonal things happening because now that the mind is very calm and peaceful and quiet, you feel completely safe, you feel completely alivened, and something about this may create a kind of happiness hormone cascade throughout your body. Or there could be something more esoteric and spiritual happening, depending on your beliefs and how you understand these things. Either way, again, a well-recorded phenomenon across every spiritual tradition. Probably one of the few things every spiritual tradition agrees on is that ultimately spiritual practice leads to bliss. Bliss isn't necessarily the end goal of sadhana and spiritual disciplines, but it is a side effect experienced by any regular practitioner. And in fact, one of the things that often hooks people into spiritual practice early on is when they sit to practice, even if they just do 10, 20 minutes of a decent technique, they often feel a kind of peace and a kind of bliss. They feel good physically in a way that they haven't in a long time. And that ends up being one of their early motivating factors to make them sit and practice regularly. In deep states of meditation, the bliss can become so overwhelming that just like with the lights and the sounds, the mind just loses itself in the bliss. The bliss can become so literally mind-numbing in a way that the mind kind of becomes totally absorbed into it. And again, it becomes an anchor for you to move deeper and deeper into states of inner attention and realization. Taste and smell we'll cover together because they're both caused by the same thing. So this is a little bit of a rarer meditative experience, and it requires a few things. Generally, it requires that something about your training has helped you produce something called the amrita, the nectar. So there are definitely spiritual traditions that don't seem to mention the nectar at all, and one thing that they have in common is they're almost always very mental spiritual traditions, things like Zen and otherwise, where maybe every now and then someone mentions it, but it's certainly not a theme. It's not a common experience. Whereas methods such as yoga, especially Hatha Yoga, a very more physically oriented yoga traditions, Taoist internal alchemy like Nedan practices, tantric practices like Tumo from the Tibetan tradition. These things that are more physically involving. So any spiritual tradition that tends to have a little bit more of a physically involved dimension to it tends to start to produce this kind of bliss, this kind of nectar. And this nectar is, again, it's once you experience it, it's undeniable. It's not a psychological phenomena. Something weird starts secreting from the back of your throat up behind the nasal passages and cavities there. And in some traditions, you actually learn how to turn your tongue all the way up and touch that. And when you do that, you'll see there's a little gland there. It starts to secrete something. I don't know why. But once it does, it has a wonderful taste. And the taste, again, the taste itself is very absorbing. Some people describe it as kind of like a honey. In my experience, it tastes more like a very subtle mango juice. But it has kind of a sweetness to it and a fragrance to it. And so it engages both the faculties of taste and of smell. So when you turn inwards, you deepen meditation and the nectar begins to flow. And it can even fill up your mouth. You have to swallow it a certain way. Once the nectar really begins to flow, then the mind again becomes very absorbed for some reason in that particular fragrance and in that particular taste. It's hard to describe. It's similar to the lights and to the sounds. For whatever reason, the mind can get very absorbed in these particular inner experiences that arise. The final thing we'll look at here is the mind itself. How does the mind turn inwards? What are its thought objects here? When the mind totally turns inwards, it's what the yogis call samadhi. And this samadhi state is one in which even all those 5 other sense faculties and those experiences we've been talking about so far really kind of disappear. They're annihilated into one complete experience of one's own nature. And so this total inner absorption of the mind itself into itself is what is called samadhi. Here I'm giving a super simple explanation of samadhi. This is not intended to be a very deep definition of it. Just for the sake of this episode, I'm defining it this way. That the samadhi is this natural, effortless, total absorption of one's mind into one's being, so that the mind itself actually kind of disappears. It loses itself into that. And it causes kind of a hypostasis of sorts, psychologically and even physically. For some great meditators, the body itself enters into a kind of hypostatic state. So these are some of the ways that these faculties manifest outwardly and inwardly, and part of how consciousness relates with form. So why should we try to engage ourselves or take advantage of this relationship between consciousness and form and these 3 gunas of the sattvic energy, rajasic and tamasic, generally trying to prefer the sattvic and avoid the rajasic and tamasic in our practice at least? Why should we take advantage of these teachings? Well, primarily, consciousness can only perceive the world one of these 6 ways. It can do so through the 5 senses or can do so through thought. And so all your perceptions are of one of these 6 objects, right? Objects of sight, objects of hearing, objects of taste, and so on, and objects of thought. Right? When these themselves become causes, right? Instead of these becoming causes of kind of degrading your own nature and creating pain and suffering, when your perceptions themselves get transformed into causes of bliss, of peace, of ecstasy, of inner awareness, of realization, then you've kind of, in a way, you're starting to like defang Maya, right? Like if we can see the illusory world and the 5 senses normally as having this strong effect as like a snake with venom in it. And through this process, many spiritual practitioners, they actually try to avoid the 5 senses. They try to totally numb the mind. But we don't really have to do that. And in fact, that's not quite practical for a lot of people in today's world who are living householder lives with families and jobs and worldly concerns. It's not very practical to try to shut off sensory experience. So instead, what we have to do is, instead of shutting it off, we have to transform it. We have to figure out how can we use the senses and the mind and allow them to do what they're always doing anyways, which is perceiving. How can we allow it to turn those perceptions into something useful? How can we take the sensory perceptions and the psychological perceptions of ourselves and turn them into a benefit and support on our spiritual path, instead of something that is constantly creating obstacles and blocks and causing pain and suffering in our lives? So instead of running away from the world, these help us engage and relate with the world in a very meaningful way. And in fact, to use the world in a way that will help support and nourish our practice, instead of allowing the world to kind of cause harm to us. So I've always looked at this as kind of defanging, in a way, the snake of illusion, so that the world is rendered kind of harmless to us. Right? The more that we develop a sattvic relationship with the 5 senses and with the mind, the more the very nature of our perception begins to change, so that even things that before were rajasic and tamasic to us begin to actually also start to become sattvic. Then once all of our perceptions start to transform into this kind of sattvic relationship of consciousness with form, before you know it, the world is now harmless to us, at least psychologically. Our suffering is no longer something being created through our sense perceptions, right? We're able to overcome it. And even our worldly life, even our day-to-day life and day-to-day activities become a cause of peace, a cause of joy, a cause of silence and stillness within ourselves, so that ultimately we're always in a good environment for meditation. And the more that we're always in a good environment psychologically and eventually physically for meditation and for turning inwards, the more naturally meditation moves from being something we do 20, 30 minutes a day to being something we're always engaged in. And so this is one of the importance of understanding the relationship of consciousness to form, and how useful it is, how it can be an incredibly useful tool for modern practitioners to relate with form in a very meaningful way to support their paths and support their practice. I hope this has been a useful video for everybody and that you enjoyed it. Please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with all of our content. Thank you.